Hey everyone, it's Bob or Dog Q Bones. Welcome back to another installment of Approving an MTG. This is more Jund Food gameplay with Tom from last time. Funny enough, this is my fourth attempt to record it. I'm accidentally stopping the recordings or something is going on. I really hope this is the one that gets through. The commentary is only getting crisper and crisper for what it's worth, but I do want to actually have a recorded product at the end of this. That would be very ideal. We've gotten to the end of the video twice now without it recording, so here's hoping. So a few notes before I begin. I'm going to be playing this video at 1.25 speed, and I'm also going to be skipping around a lot more than you might be used to in the previous videos. That's because Isaac Crute, who's a great player, is on Black Green Squirrel. The triggers can get a little monotonous at times, so in an effort to keep the pace of the video reasonable, I'm going to speed it up a little bit. I also apologize. I'm going to be looking down a lot more too to ensure that the video keeps recording because for whatever reason it keeps cutting out. So without further ado, let's jump right in. So Tom's on the play, opens up a pretty reasonable hand. Far from great, but you have your colors, you have some spells. You don't have any of your engine pieces yet, but what are you going to do, right? With Jund Food, I think a big mistake a lot of players make is that they only keep hands that have a lot going on. You kind of just have to keep a hand that does anything. Tom had a decision between playing Gilded Goose or Witch's Oven first. I really like the Goose line. It opens himself up for more lines. So I think that was very smart. Pretty easy line, give or take, but very smart. So from the Darkboard pathway into the Witch's Oven, we can clearly see that Isaac is definitely on Black Green Squirrel. I told you that at the beginning of the video, but you saw Luris. You're not positive what they're playing yet. So I also want to stop here because now we have an interesting decision point. We can play Mayhem Devil, or we could play Witch's Oven and Goose. How do we decide which is which? So, a philosophy I prescribe to is the game plan philosophy, which is broken down into two questions you ask yourself every turn. How do I win? How does my opponent win? Right now, it's a little too soon to determine how the opponent's going to win, so let's focus on how I win. And what that could be extended to for this scenario is, what is the line that's going to put me the closest to winning? You think about it. All right, I deploy Mayhem Devil. What does that accomplish for me? It's a 3/3 body. If Isaac follows up with a Cauldron Familiar, it can interrupt their loop from being good. It just applies the most pressure. What about if we do Gilded Goose, Witch's Oven? If we draw a trail, this is a much better line, and we don't have to use a food. So just based on that solely, I think it's pretty clear which line we should go for. We should go for the Mayhem Devil line. It does a lot more for us at this juncture. It plays around more from the opponent. It actually just does something where Gilded Goose and Witch's Oven realistically just does not do that much. So let's see if Tom agrees. And Tom does agree. Takes him a second to just not reevaluate, but just make sure it's what he wants to do. Really nice. He has plenty of time while I rush into it. Plays the Mayhem Devil. So I'll skip ahead a tiny bit. Isaac does in fact have the Cauldron Familiar, so Mayhem Devil is an even, greater line for this turn, but unfortunately, he also has the Fatal Push. So I would say that's a punish, but a punish implies that there was inherent risk to this line, when it really wasn't. Mayhem Devil was just unequivocally the correct line at this point. It just sucks that Isaac had the answer. Tom is rewarded, however, with the best possible draw at this point, Trail of Crumbs. What I really like is that before playing a land, Tom deploys Trail of Crumbs. What this allows is that, okay, you eat the food, you see what you get off the trail, and then you can make your decision from there, because maybe you might want to change your decision based on what you draw, right? Like you're probably just playing Gilded Goose this turn, but, just in case, right? However, Tom backtracks on that for whatever reason, decides to play the lands first, and then crack trail. Is it really a big deal at this juncture? No, I wouldn't say that it is. But as I've been saying in the other videos, it's not a big deal until it is, right? So I don't love that ordering. It didn't end up mattering, but it could have in a different game. So he has trail, he has double, goose. So now he's in this pretty scary position where he's ahead on cards for sure because he has a trail going. Isaac doesn't, but he's very behind on board. Ravenous Squirrel and Cat Loop is a pretty strong combination of cards, and Tom does not have much going on right now. So he really has only two good options. Well, first, I apologize. You got to go for trail. You have the excess food. I think most people would assume that, like, okay, let's find something to do off trail first. But unfortunately, he only finds a Blood Crypt. So now we're in the same spot as before. So what does he do? He has pretty much two options. He grabs Gigantha, and he can play a tap land or an untapped land to play Oven at that point. Play an Oven, hold up mana to make food. Play double Oven, hold up mana to make food. A few lines, but all functionally the same beyond the are we playing Oven and holding up food or just getting Gigantha. So once again, we have to consider what is the line that's going to help you win, right? How am I going to win this game? If we get Gigantha, does that help us win? Well, Ravenous Squirrel is probably going to outpace it. Gigantha is very bad in the face of a Cat Oven Loop because you can't attack into it, and you're not going to be able to block the squirrel. What is it accomplishing, right? How we're winning is that we need to card advantage him at this point. So based on that, playing 1 to 2 ovens and then holding up food is the correct play. Now, would you rather play 1 oven or 2 ovens? That's a great question. Even now, I'm not actually entirely sure what the correct answer is. I think it's close because you can just play the pathway and have an easy untapped land. But I was thinking that you might have wanted to play the tap land to preserve life, and then you could have the untapped land for later when it's more important. So I'm not exactly positive. I'm sure playing the double oven versus the single oven, they're both very, very comparable lines. And I would venture to say the double oven line is probably better, especially if you find a Cauldron Familiar, then you don't have to worry about having to use excess mana later. Not having excess mana later for all the trail triggers you're going to get. But Tom chose the correct line, is the moral of the story. So, a second squirrel even. So, it's starting to look very tenuous for Tom. Isaac's just going off, doing cat things. And Isaac does a great attack here. So, now we have a decision. Do we block? Do we chump block? And make a food, throw a goose into an oven? Or do we just take it at this point? If we're thinking game plans, how do we get out of this game? Because now we're definitely behind. If we're thinking game plans, you got to take that attack. We're going to need both geese to do trail things. That seems like an imperative at this point. So I really like taking the squirrel here. You have, enough life to do it once. Probably not twice, but at least for this turn, you want as many resources as you can. So I really like that. Make a food. Yep, all well and good. Excuse the yawn. So interestingly enough, Isaac does sacrifice the plant to the Witch's Oven, but then doesn't bring back Cauldron Familiar for the extra point. I'm not sure what Isaac was playing around there. Maybe he had a good reason I'm not thinking of. That was the one suspect line that Isaac made throughout this, but I'm not even saying it's incorrect. I'm just not sure what he was going for. It happened a little quick, so I'm actually going to rewind. I apologize. I got too caught up in Isaac's line. So Tom untaps, draws squirrel, instantly deploys it. Now, this is one of the most interesting plays in the entire match, and I'll tell you why. So, Tom is behind on life. Tom is behind on board. And in a sense, Tom is behind on cards. Maybe they're about at card parity, but at best parity. He is not in a great spot to win this game. So, we have to consider what his outs are. Tom immediately jams squirrel, right? But I think he should have taken the time to consider how is he getting out of this game let's think through the deck. And you can even follow along with me. If you scroll down a little bit in the description, you will see the deck list. So we need to find something off trail. What are the permanents that can save Tom at this point? We have Culture Familiar, definitely a good one. We have Binding the Old Gods, not amazing, but it's something. Or we have Core Vault, Faker's King. So let's run through the lines quickly. If you play Squirrel, activate Trail, find a Culture Familiar, that's great. You're going to have a big squirrel. You can chump block one of their squirrels, and you can start to outpace both of their squirrels. That puts you in a really good spot. If you find Binding the Old Gods, you have a 2/2 squirrel. You could shock yourself binding the big squirrel. It's not amazing, but it gives you some time. If you play Squirrel and find a Core Vault, you're then forced to sacrifice the tap goose to the oven, use the other goose to produce mana to cast Core Vault, and probably sacrifice a land or something to the Core Vault trigger, right? So we're talking about 10 cards at this juncture, 4 Culture Familiar, 3 Binding, 3 Core Vault, that can realistically save you. I don't believe there's anything else. Mayhem Devil's not going to do it. Another Goose is not going to do it. Trail's not going to do it realistically. So you really need one of those 10. And 7 of them work better when you deploy Squirrel first. And 3 of them, the Core Vault, work worse when you deploy Squirrel first. So based on the odds, you should deploy Squirrel first, right? No, you should not. So let's go through that. What is Squirrel meaningfully doing before this trail? If you find Cauldron Familiar, you're going to outpace those squirrels regardless. Missing 1 counter is not inconsequential. I don't want to say it's inconsequential because it isn't. But it's not the end of the world either. Binding of the Old Gods, it's kind of inconsequential for this turn because your squirrel is not going to outpace their squirrels in any capacity. And honestly, you might even just have to throw the squirrel under a chump block because you kill the squirrel, they're coming in with another squirrel. We don't want to give up geese at this point because we have trail going on. So we probably have to give up on the squirrel. Then we're left with Core Vault. If we deploy Squirrel immediately and then find Core Vault could realistically save us at this point. But then we're going to have to give up so many resources because we decided to do Squirrel first. Rather, if we did Trail first, find Core Vault, then we can just shock in a land, play Core Vault, like sacrifice a land, and still have a reasonable amount of resources. Throw Goose underneath one of the squirrels, throw Core Vault underneath the smaller squirrel, could probably get a good block there. They're not in a great spot. But because we play Squirrel first, we're actually severely limiting the amount of outs we realistically have to beat Isaac in a position where we're pretty far behind. I think Tom didn't think through all this. And of course, that's the long form explanation. But that was the first thing I thought of when I was watching this game. How do we come back from this? This is all about game plans, right? How do we win? We need one of those 10 cards. And one of those cards, we need every last bit of mana we can get. So I don't like deploying Squirrel right now. But he deploys Squirrel. Activates Trail. And unfortunately, nightmare scenario. Coming up in 3, 2. Full whiff. It's so unlikely. Because you play like six cards that don't get hit off trail? Something like that. 2 Thoughtseize, 3 to 4 Fatal Push. I don't have the list in front of me, but it's something like that, right? So yeah, that's the nightmare. However, Tom recoups a little bit by not grabbing Gigantha. He still knows that the way he gets out of this game is going to be through Trail, not through Gigantha. However, Isaac does some cat triggers, plays Tower, uses the treasure, and then Meathook Massacre for 4. So what Tom has to do at this point is make a squirrel big enough to survive. Otherwise, he just gets killed, right? He's at 9 if he doesn't make a squirrel to survive. Actually, he doesn't technically have to. So right now, loading a little bit. They have a 9/9 and a 5/5. That's 14. They lose 8. That's 6. However, with a full cat loop, that would be lethal if Tom doesn't produce a food or produce a blocker. So he is forced into action in some capacity. But what is the best way to go about it? I think Tom almost gets there. So sacrificing the goose first, like that. But what do you do with said goose? You go for the trail? Very acceptable. I like that line as well. Let's trail. Let's find something to do. There's the Corvold we were talking about. So maybe we can get something going on. However, I don't love what he does here. So what he does here is that he decides to use the Ravenous Squirrel's ability to sacrifice the Gilded Goose instead of throwing the goose into the oven and then eating the food, naturally, and then using trail. What that would do, though, understandably, is that it would force... Actually, no. It wouldn't even force Tom to chump block because he will have enough life to survive, technically. He probably would still want to chump block anyway, but then he doesn't get a food from the squirrel, and that feels kind of bad. But trail digs you deeper, and as we established at this point, we really need something going on. We have the Corvold, and at this juncture, I believe the only way we're coming back from this game is that we're going to need to draw a Cauldron Familiar. If we go Corvold into Cauldron Familiar, we do actually have a realistic chance of coming back. It's not a high chance, but it is a realistic chance. So I think Tom shot himself in the foot a little bit here by denying himself an extra look to find Cauldron Familiar specifically. So, board gets wiped. Not before Isaac, obviously, throws the cat into the oven. Oh, excuse me. I thought it was exact lethal. It's actually a bit more over lethal. So, if Tom ate the food, it would be, let's see, 7-3-1. So he would survive only by 1 point. And I guess with Meat Hook Massacre, that wouldn't really work because he can definitely get drained out. So he was definitely forced to chump no matter what. But unfortunately, Tom finds just another Corvold, not the Cauldron Familiar. Sacrifices the food, which makes sense to me. Probably should have just sacrificed the land at that point. Finds another land, is dead. Not much he could do at that point. So, the Jund food versus squirrel matchup is interesting because it's all about attrition. It's kind of like the Jund food mirror. Oh, I just realized I'm blocking the sideboarding a little bit. Let me back that up a little bit. Is that the start of it? Close enough. All right, so that's the sideboard he's working with. You can also see that in the description below what he's working with. I just don't want to block the sideboarding. So I like bringing in Fatal Push. So what I like here, remember, it's a War of Attrition. We want all of our attrition pieces and to stop their attrition. How they grind is a lot of graveyard stuff. So what we really want to prioritize is the Kothuses, the Soul Guy Lanterns, the Corvolds, because 2 of them interact with the opponent's ability to grind. 1 of them gives us a better ability to grind. Also, we want the Fatal Push because it's just so good against Squirrel. That's perfectly fine. So what I would take out here is that I think Binding is really, really bad at this juncture. It's a 4-mana removal spell that you're running into 1-drops that can easily be sacrificed to a Deadly Dispute or a Village Rites, which they tend to play like 7 of those effects. So Binding is really bad here. But unfortunately, with Tom taking out the Goose, keeping in Bindings, not bringing the Corvold, I think he misevaluated his position in the matchup a little bit. He didn't bring in all the Soul Guide Lanterns either. Just moving my head up. Woo. So I think he didn't understand exactly how this matchup is supposed to go, which is definitely going to hurt. You really need to know your matchups and why you board the way you do. But anyway, hand 1, awful. Obviously, Gilded Goose and 6 lands, not at all what we're looking for. Hand 2 is brutal because it's a 1-lander, but we do have things going on. We have a Cauldron Familiar, we have Double Push, we have Squirrel, we have a Devil potentially. We have a dog downstairs. Amazing. So we have to ask ourselves at this point, how does this hand win the game? And unfortunately, it doesn't really have a path to victory. Even if you draw multiple lands in a row, it's still not even that great of a hand. It's only saved by the virtue of Corvold, I would say. And I just don't think that's good enough. So I would mulligan. It feels bad. That's not even seeing whether the opponent mulligans or not. But thankfully, Isaac does. So that makes the mulligan decision even easier. And then we're graced with such a good 5. 4 lands, all your colors, Gilded Goose, and a Korvold. When you're behind, you need to get a little greedy, and you need a game plan more than ever. And this seems like such a great game plan. Gilded Goose into Korvold is something going on. However, Tom actually does not keep the Korvold, interestingly enough. And I really wonder why. Because what else is going on in his hand, right? Now he has nothing going on. He has a Goose, he has a Lantern, and he has nada. So, he just got to play with what he has. So, plays Goose turn 1, that makes sense. Holds up for food, makes sense again. So, turn 3, he has 3 choices, right? He just drew a Cauldron Familiar for turn. You can either grab Jegantha, you could play a 1-drop, hold open food, or you could play 2 1-drops. So once again, how do we decide? What is the way we win this game? How do I win this game? Tom is behind on cards by 2 full cards. So he needs to make a bit of a greedier play. He needs to make a more proactive play, because if you're behind on 2 cards in an attrition matchup, the odds of you winning the long game don't seem amazing, especially with this hand. Is it impossible? Of course not. Of course not. But they're not looking good. So what is the line that's going to give Tom the greatest chance to win at this point? Personally, I think it's Jegantha. Jegantha is pretty bad in this matchup. I'm not arguing that. But it is an avenue to win because it is a 5-5. If Isaac just has a really crappy hand, you might just be able to win with a 5-5, because realistically, you play a Cauldron Familiar and make a food, that doesn't really accomplish anything. You play a Lantern, which doesn't exile anything, make a food, that doesn't accomplish anything. You play 2 1-drops, that accomplishes even less, because now you don't even have an extra food resource if you happen to draw a Trail or a Korvold, so on and so forth. So, what does Tom decide to do? Unfortunately, I think he makes back-to-back pretty hefty misplays. I think he was playing this match super tight for the most part until, this juncture, really. So he plays the Lantern, which just doesn't give him any value, but I guess in his mind, he's looking to crack it for a card. Okay, I understand that logic. You feel pressured, you really need something going on. But to get rid of the one piece of good graveyard interaction you have in a matchup that's probably going to go long because you don't have a means of killing them quickly, is going to hurt, right? If you're just using it to cycle. I understand, but it definitely hurts. So Isaac finds a Trail. Another Colony Garden. So not too bad. However, interestingly enough, Tom doesn't even crack the Lantern. So this harkens back to something I talked about in a previous video of the concept of think, play, play, play. You want to think through all your game actions before executing any of them, because what likely happened with Tom is that he was like, know what? I'm going to play Cauldron Familiar. I'm going to play Soul Guide Lantern. I'm going to crack Soul Guide Lantern. But then realized he didn't want to. And because he realized only after the fact, now he can't take it back. He loses out on a food resource. He loses out on grabbing Jegantha immediately, and that's pretty consequential. He loses out on the ability to hit something in the graveyard off the initial ETB from Soul Guide Lantern. This is a pretty rough spot for Tom now. And again, this is why I love showcasing this game. And again, Tom is a great player, and I'm not talking poorly of him, because he is a very strong player, and even strong players are going to make mistakes, right? And this is the perfect example of these small mistakes don't matter until they do. That was a very small mistake, but that really matters. And this is a scenario that it does. He draws a land, and he still has nothing going on. If he grabbed Jegantha last turn, he could have deployed Jegantha this turn. But now, what does he do? He just has to grab Jegantha now and play tap lands, which I agree with. He's still saying that, know what? I'm still not cracking the Lantern. I made a mistake. I'm not going to compound my error. Very good from Tom. Do not compound that error when you don't have to. However, Isaac has a Gilded Goose, and things are looking a little grim already. But a squirrel draw, not terrible. because now you can deploy the squirrel, deploy Gigantha. You have 2 beaters. We have a Culture Familiar, and you know what? We could start sacrificing Culture Familiar to the squirrel, bring it back. We have 2 reasonably sized beaters. We actually have a game plan now. But remember, this could have been a much different game if this was a Corval turn, right? Because, we would have actually casted it the previous turn. But I believe this game is going to, work out very differently because of what Tom chose to put away. It happens, right? But let's see. So another Deadly Dispute. Sacrificing a food, such a gross interaction because with Trail Out, that's drawing 3 functional cards, and that is rough. And Isaac finds another goose with that trail. And he's working with 8 cards in hand versus Tom's 0. So this is looking very, very grim at this juncture. Finds a Meat Hook Massacre. So be it. That's not too great right now because you can make both your creatures pretty large. So it's not the end of the world, but definitely not great. We're going to skip ahead a little bit while he's thinking. Decides to go for a Meat Hook on 3 to get rid of that squirrel now. Very, very nice play from Isaac. Like, he analyzed, that's the second level of game plans, right? How do I lose? And Isaac's like, well, the way I lose, I get beat to death at this juncture. I'm not losing the attrition war when my opponent is down literal 7 cards. I'm going to lose if I get beat to death. So by giving up some resources now to kill the squirrel, very excellent line. Very, very nice from Isaac. And because he decides to deploy a goose, there was a decision before on whether or not we wanted to bring back Culture Familiar, but there's no point now. We draw a land for a turn. Things are looking grim. But what do? Right now, we need the cycle. We don't have the luxury of holding onto this lantern anymore. And we find a Clothis. Not a bad draw, honestly. If the way we're going to win is by beating them to death in some capacity, Clothis can definitely help us there. But Isaac just keeps drawing stuff, finds a Phyrexian Tower. I'll just keep skipping ahead. Plays another goose, so the 3rd goose. Plays another Colony Garden. Gets back Luris. So pretty much just a card advantage turn, which makes perfect sense at this point. He's not in much danger. He's still at 14 with the Clothis trigger. He has double goose. He has a Colony Garden to chump. He is sitting pretty at this point. He could afford to take a turn off to just amass even more cards, especially if his hand isn't doing terribly much. Which it may not be. He might just have a lot of air, but at this point, air is kind of all he needs to actually secure a victory. So Tom here has a really interesting decision here that I absolutely love. So our game plan is to attack Isaac to death, right? That's the plan. So not attacking with Gigantha there seems super weird. Like, we need to get rid of the cards eventually, right? We can't just wait forever. We're losing slowly, or maybe not even that slowly, right? However, what Tom was actually thinking is like, you know what? It seems very likely that they have a means to sacrifice the plant, so the attacking doesn't matter much. But furthermore, I believe they have a way to interact with my board this turn. I'm going to need every single card I can get. And we're going to see why. So Isaac's just doing more squirrel things, more cat things, more trail things. Drawing a bunch of cards, ovens, lands. He has like 30 cards in hand. And Isaac decides to, I believe, go after... Oh, no, still more trail stuff. My apologies. I believe he tries to Fatal Push the squirrel, if I remember correctly. Okay. So finally, after all of that, goes to Fatal Push the squirrel. So because Tom didn't attack with Gigantha, he can now bring back Culture Familiar after activating Gigantha and be able to sacrifice both the Culture Familiar and the squirrel, which I think was an excellent, excellent line. So, he had a few stumbles at the beginning of the game, but is definitely making up with this play now. As I said, Tom's a very good player. And he finds these lines. When I was first watching it, I'm like, why didn't he attack? Even I didn't see it, admittedly. And then I realized what he was going for. Really excellent work from him. Unfortunately, didn't really draw much to really help him out there, but what are you going to do, right? And unfortunately, Tom just kind of continues to draw dead. Just has a bunch of lands and a Culture Familiar. His line is forced here. Attack with Gigantha. They're going to chump block, presumably. Feed to Oven. You play Culture Familiar and you pass, right? Really not much you can do here. Isaac is just going to keep running wild over there. Just more stuff. Laris, bring back Goose. We find a Binding, which is nice, I guess. But things are just looking so bad. We have to kill Laris, of course. But they get a free eat off the Oven. They now have Cauldron Familiar Loop to keep pace with their Clothis. And with Meathook Massacre, we're actually losing a life per every exchange. But they didn't even have to use Oven because of Deadly Dispute. This game, I think we can all agree, is pretty much over. I'll skip ahead to make sure there's no other relevant point of contentions. But just more trails, just holding 9,000 cards in hand. Cards are just spilling all over the table at this point. Isaac can't control them all. He's just borrowing cards from people sitting next to him. He cannot contain his own power at this point. And let's see. Clothis just drawing another land. Yeah, this game is pretty much over. Not pretty much over. It is over. And no, I'll keep skipping ahead. No real decisions. Can't attack. You're too far down. Squirrel, trail, cat. More squirrels. Loading screens. Having to chump. And yeah, Tom gives it up after finding a Gilded Goose. So, what can we learn from that video? So that was kind of a massacre in both games. If I played that, would I have won that match? No, I would have gotten crushed too. But something I really want you guys to consider, a very, very, very important part about playing Magic is knowing how to play from behind and knowing what to prioritize in certain matchups. The latter is something you have to just, gain experience on, read articles, practice the matchup, so on and so forth. But learning how to play from behind is a very vital skill I believe people just don't prioritize enough. Tom was on a Mold of 5 on the play versus a 6, and he puts away a Corvold. That was a reasonable game plan you can have when behind. When you're behind, you do not have the luxury of spinning your wheels. You have to start making advances, or you're just going to get run over, right? So I'm not sure where his head was at with putting away the Corvold. He even said when he messaged me, I did not like how I played that game. And he's smart enough to know, no, I did not play that well because probably these reasons I'm talking about. But I appreciate that he does not have an ego to not show me because he feels embarrassed, but he wanted to use this as a learning opportunity for others to show that even great players can make, some not great decisions. And for not crazy reasons, he probably just assumed that, no, the Corvold's too slow. I want to draw into something else. It happens, right? So anyway, that's the end of this video. Thank you so, so much for watching. I hope you learned a ton. If you like this content, please consider giving it a like and subscribing to the channel. It would really help. Please give me any feedback you can think of. If you really like this particular type of content, let me know because I enjoy doing this content too. If you want to see me do other types of content, which I will be doing soon, I promise, let me know what you're interested in. Just let me know. I'm pretty interactive in the comments, so I'd love to hear from you guys. Thank you so much. Have a great day.